Welcome to Crimes Through Time, a weekly snapshot of crime history. Alice Arden hated her husband Thomas. She was in a long-standing affair with a local tailor, and Thomas was in the way. Alice decided the only remedy to the situation was murder. It would take 2 years and many attempts before Alice and her conspirators would be successful on the 14th of February 1551. But like most cases we discuss, they had given little thought to getting away with the killing, and Alice was quickly tried, convicted and burnt at the stake for the crime of petty treason. Let's explore the murder of Thomas Arden, which would lead to 8 executions. Alice Brigantine was born in 1516 to parents John Brigantine and Alice Squire. She was described as, quote, young, tall and well-favoured, of shape and countenance. She married Thomas Arden, a, quote, private gentleman, a man of comfortable means from his own business dealings. The couple settled in Faversham Abbey, Kent, where they welcomed daughter Margaret in 1538. At some point, Alice began an affair with Richard Mosby, a local tailor. He had been in the employ of Edward North, 1st Baron North, prior to setting up his successful tailor shop in London. The affair was far from a secret. Richard often visited Alice at the family home. Thomas turned a blind eye. He did not want to sever the ties with Alice's family. Over time, Alice grew an intense hatred of Thomas and decided that he had to die. She made the first attempt on Thomas's life herself when she mixed poison in with the milk while preparing his morning porridge. However, she hadn't taken into account the bitter taste of the poison. Thomas would only eat a spoon or 2 before leaving the rest of his breakfast. She realised she needed an accomplice in order to complete the job. She turned to John Green, a local businessman who had a grudge against Thomas. John had claimed a piece of land at the back side of Faversham Abbey. Thomas challenged the claim, stating its close proximity to his own property, and managed to successfully take control of the land from John. The 2 men had already come to blows, and John was happy to see his rival disposed of. But neither wanted to do the dirty work of killing, and decided the best plan would be to pay a mercenary £10 to complete the murder. It would be on a business trip to London when John would find a murderer for hire. John worked for Sir Anthony Agar, and he called him to London for business. Not wanting to travel alone, he asked his friend George Bradshaw to accompany him. George was a local goldsmith and veteran soldier, having served under Sir Richard Cavendish during the siege of Boulogne. On their journey to London, they bumped into an acquaintance of George's, another veteran called Will. He told John of Will's reputation. He had, quote, committed many robberies and horrid murders in France. Will's current occupation was highwayman, robbing carriages, quote, with a sword and buckler. John seized his opportunity and hired Will to kill Thomas. It was decided that Will would attack in a public place or whilst Thomas was travelling, so the crime would look like a random robbery. So when Thomas returned to London for business, John took Will to watch him as he walked to Old St Paul's Cathedral, the nave of which was a public promenade at this time. But no safe opportunity arose for Will to strike. John saw that Thomas was accompanied by a servant called Michael Saunderson, who was loyal to Alice. He decided to use that loyalty to gain access to their sleeping quarters, asking for the bolt to be left off that night. Will said he would kill both of them so as not to leave any witnesses. John told Michael of this threat. Shockingly, Michael was sure to thoroughly secure the door that night and every night of the trip to prevent anyone from gaining access, thwarting the plan. They tried again on his return journey to Kent. Michael pretended his horse was lame, meaning Thomas would have been travelling alone. Instead, he opted to join some acquaintances in their carriage, so was not isolated enough for Will to ambush. Thomas arrived home safely, much to Alice's disappointment. One last public attempt was made. Thomas had business with Thomas Cheney, Lord Warden of the Ports in South East England. He sent Michael to the Isle of Sheppey to meet Cheney. He would return with a letter. Alice took the letter and hid it, and Michael claimed to Thomas he had lost it. Frustrated, Thomas decided to travel to meet Cheney in person, just as Alice had hoped. Will and George Shakebag, a fellow highwayman, were instructed to set up an ambush, quote, in a broom close, between Faversham and the ferry. But the men were unfamiliar with the area and set up in the wrong place, failing to meet Thomas on either his journey to the Isle or on his return home. Now Valentine's Day 1551 was approaching. There was to be a fair. Alice suggested to Richard that he challenge Thomas to a fight in public and that he could kill him in a duel, but they abandoned this idea because Thomas was unlikely to accept a challenge given his toleration of the affair. So finally, an ultimately successful murder plot was hatched to kill Thomas in his own home, but it would take a whole team to pull it off. On the 14th of February 1551, Will was hidden in a closet at the end of the parlour in the Arden home. He would remain there until given the prearranged signal. Alice sent all the servants on errands, keeping just Michael Saunderson and Elizabeth Stafford at the house, who knew of the plan. At 7 p.m, Thomas returned home. He was greeted by Richard. Alice said that supper wasn't ready yet, and the men agreed to a game of backgammon in the parlour. Thomas was positioned so his back faced the closet. Richard kept him distracted before giving the signal, quote, "Now I take you, sir." Will sprang from the closet and started to strangle Thomas with a towel. Richard grabbed a 14-pound pressing iron and hit him around the head, then drew his dagger and slit his throat. Will stole all the money in Thomas's pockets and took his rings. Alice paid him the £10 fee, and John supplied him with a horse to make his getaway. Alice, wanting to make sure Thomas was dead or just out of cruelty, stabbed him 7 or 8 times with the dagger. The servants then got to work cleaning the room. The dagger and the bloody cleaning cloths were then discarded. Thomas was hidden in the closet. Guests would then arrive for supper, including Richard's sister, Cicely Pounder. Alice made sure to comment on the strange absence of her husband and to express her concern. Margaret Arden, the couple's daughter, played on the virginals and the whole party danced and made merry. Once the company had left, Alice sent the servants to look for Thomas, while she, Margaret, Cecily and the maid Elizabeth redressed Thomas into his nightclothes and transported the body outside the house. They, quote, carried it out into a field adjoining to the churchyard and to his own garden wall, through which he went to church. They laid him down about 10 paces from the door of that garden. This was to give the appearance that he had been murdered outside after he had returned home and dressed for bed. Alice spent the night crying in worry for her missing husband. The servants alerted the neighbours, and finally in the morning the local mayor was informed and a town-wide search was organised, which resulted in the discovery of Thomas. Suspicion almost immediately fell on Alice. It was strange that Thomas was dressed for bed. What was he doing out there, especially on a cold winter's night when it was snowing? The fresh snow had preserved footprints of several people walking between the body disposal site and the Arden house. It was very clear that the body had been transported from inside the house. The house and surrounding area was searched. Hair and blood from Thomas was found. It was obvious that he had met his end in the parlour. The dagger and cloths were also found. They had been discarded, but not hidden. Alice was confronted by the mayor and, quote, very strictly examined. As evidence was found, she was asked to explain it at length. In the end, she confessed her guilt and named all her associates. Alice and Margaret Arden, Michael Saunderson, the servant, and Elizabeth Stafford, the maid, were all arrested immediately. Richard wasn't there but was found asleep at the home for Adam Fowle, his friend. Both were arrested. Will and John Green had fled. George Bradshaw was also arrested. He was named in letters between Alice and John Green as the man who would introduce them to Will. He was accused of being, quote, the procurer of Will. Despite all the other conspirators testifying that they had never seen or spoken to George and that he was unconnected to the case, the court was not convinced, and he too was found guilty of murder. Alice Arden, guilty of petty treason, because she had murdered her husband, was burnt at the stake in Canterbury. Michael Saunderson, guilty of petty treason for murdering his employer, was drawn and hanged in Feversham. Elizabeth Stafford, guilty of petty treason for murdering her employer, was burnt at the stake in Faversham. Richard Mosby and his sister Cecily Pounder, guilty of murder, were hanged at Smithfield. George Bradshaw was hanged in chains at Canterbury. Eventually the law would catch up with both John Green and Will after many years on the run. John was found guilty of murder and, quote, hanged in chains in the highway between Offspring and Broughton. Before he died, John attempted to clear George's name. He explained that he was not privy to the murder plan and just simply introduced acquaintances. It was a shame that he didn't think to come forward to the court when it was possible to save his life. Will would meet the hangman at Flushing. Adam Fowle was found innocent and discharged, but spent many months in Marshalsea prison for the kindness of giving his friend a bed. The murder was mentioned in the Chambers Book of Days as a local legend. Quote, "It was long said that no grass would grow on the spot where Thomas's dead body was found. Some, in accordance with the superstitions of the time, attributed this to the murder." In 1592, the murder was dramatised in the play Arden of Faversham. The writer has long been disputed, but William Shakespeare was one of the most likely authors, with a co-writer, Thomas Watson. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you think of this case in the comments below, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.